Hi, konnichiwa, Ara-sensei desu. Yoroshiku onegai shimasu. So in this video, we will talk about Japanese verb groups. Okay, first of all, Japanese verbs are divided into three groups. Group 1 or U verbs, Group 2 or Ru verbs, and Group 3 or irregular verbs. Group 1 verbs are called U verbs because they all end in U. Group 2 verbs are also called Ru verbs because they end in Ru. And finally, Group 3 verbs are called irregular verbs because aside from the verb kuru, which means to come, they are actually nouns added with the verb suru, which means to do. So how do we determine the groupings of these verbs? The easiest to identify are the group 3 verbs because it is only composed of the verb kuru, which means to come, and the verbs with suru, which means to do. So from this list, we have kaimono suru, which means to shop, and benki suru, which means to study, that belongs to group 3 verbs. Okay, for group 1 and group 2 verbs, if the verb does not end in ru, it automatically belongs to group 1 verbs. Again, from this list, we have matsu, to wait, kau, to buy, and yomu, to read. They do not end in ru, so they belong to group 1 verbs. Okay, so let's put them to group 1 verbs. Now, we're left with verbs that all end in r. To identify if it belongs to group 1 or group 2 verbs, we first have to look at the vowel before r. If the verb ends in aru, oru, and uru, it belongs to group 1 verbs. So we have suwaru, to sit, toru, to take, and tsukuru, to make. They end in aru, oru, and uru, so they belong to group 1 verbs. Okay? Finally, if the verb ends in iru or eru, they belong to group 2 verbs. So we have miru, to watch, to look, to see, oshieru, to teach or to tell, and taberu, that belongs to group 2 verbs. Okay, so let's review. Group 3 verbs are composed of the verb kuru, to come, and suru, to do. And for group 2 verbs, if the verb ends in iru or eru, it belongs to group 2 verbs. And finally, for group 1 verbs, if the verb does not end in ru, like the verb matsu, yomu, and kau, it belongs to group 1 verbs. And if the verb ends in aru, oru, and uru, like the verbs toru, tsukuru, and suwaru, they belong to group 1 verbs. Okay, so let's practice. We have the verb oboiru, to memorize. It ends in eru, so it belongs to group 2 verb. Next, we have the verb kariru, to borrow. It ends in iru, so it also belongs to group 2 verbs. Next, renshu suru. It ends in suru, so it belongs to group 3 verbs. Next, we have wakaru, to understand. It ends in aru, so it belongs to group 1 verbs. And finally, we have the verb kiku, which means to ask or to listen or to hear. So it does not end in ru, so it automatically belongs to group 1 verbs. Okay, wait, there are exemptions. There are verbs that end in eru or iru, but they do not belong to group 2 verbs. Instead, they belong to group 1 verbs. For the meantime, please memorize these 5 verbs. Okay, so that's it for now for Japanese verb groups. Please like and please subscribe for more videos. はい、ある先生です。どうもありがとうございます。